So give us your analysis of this reporting. Is it as clear cut as this BBC report wants to make it out to be?
Yeah. So at its core, what we are witnessing is a dangerous sort of integrated global system. I appreciate that the headline for this interview speaks to the US's role, because I do not think there has been enough conversation about how this has been playing out. The tactics, the technologies, the geopolitical strategies, um, as refined in this African conflict in these African conflict zones, specifically through a sort of framework of these military commands like AFRICOM, do not just stay there. So I do think it's important to have a larger conversation and connect these dots to see how all of this actually does impact and shape domestic policing in the U.S., because these are replicated neocolonial arrangements where we see African nations are tasked as junior partners in regional pacifications, and we see that playing out here domestically with this misleadership class. But just to contextualize Sudan a bit, um, I think I talk about the ways that it is not discussed enough. We
Mm-hmm.
talk about that for sure, because we understand the impacts of colonialism and imperialism as it's formatted in Zionism to be really the objective, the primary objective in terms of how we're understanding defeating imperialism. And I do think that Sudan is a part of that conversation. Well, we can talk about El Bashir being the sort of canary in the coal mine, if you will. So the capture of El Bashir by the UAE-backed Rapid Support Forces, and we could talk about the United Emirates in a bit, is a culmination of this sort of integrated system. It demonstrates how external powers like the UAE can be used or are using a proxy force like the RSF to achieve regional dominance, controlling a strategic kind of crossroads, and then also its resources. And the RSF's tactics, siege, starvations, attacks on hospitals, massacres, these are just a brutal form of population control. The international community, when we talk about like the kind of silence or the sort of cloak, if you will,
Mm-hmm.
around the information coming about and out of Sudan around what's happening, has really resulted in a sort of tepid community response. But it also shows how economic and strategic interests conflict, if you will, with human rights. So for me, the significance in how we've come to understand Palestine over the last 2 years of that genocide versus how the horrific massacres and the wiping out of a people in Sudan has been not only understood but reported, has been the difference between understanding Palestine through a lens of decolonial struggle versus understanding Sudan through a lens of humanitarian crisis. And the latter kind of disallows the broader public to really begin to understand how it has come to be, as opposed to a general sort of African Civil War, quote unquote, narrative that's perpetual.
So is it a matter of, yes, in Sudan, in Darfur, people are starving. Yes, atrocities are being committed, but if you look at it simply through that lens, then you fail to understand the why, and you fail to understand the who is responsible.
Yeah. So even when we talk about, what is the US's role, or even highlighting that this month is Black Alliance for Peace fifth annual month of action against AFRICOM, I think it's important to kind of contextualize how it's come to be. We talk about this sort of great grab of Africa, how it was split up, and this sort of colonial components of Africa, but we do not talk enough about the continuous sort of grab and capture or struggled for capture of the continent, and then also the role that neocolonialism plays today. And I think that's where AFRICOM comes into play, because AFRICOM's main aim in this regard is to intensify and coordinate activities dealing with this sort of quote unquote war on terror, right? Which would involve these sort of civil wars that are more or less manufactured. So they're wanting to control this in Africa by coordinating and managing initiatives furthering security development, these sort of terms that they always use, and this sort of discourse around counterterrorism, which involves various military partnerships and training and programs that it oversees. And then we know prior to AFRICOM, and I think this is important, because AFRICOM comes into existence the latter half of 2007 as Bush is ending out, and it expands under Obama's presidency with the cooperation of the Congressional Black Caucus. But prior to its formation, it was African states were dealt with through the U.S. Central Command, CENTCOM, which was responsible for tasking or dealing with Egypt, the Horn of Africa, Kenya, amongst others. The Indo-Pacific Command that dealt with various Indian Ocean nations, such as Madagascar and the Comoros, and then the European Command, which most of the African states fell under. And so you can see this kind of continuous slicing up of Africa until it becomes centralized under AFRICOM, but ultimately with the goal of control, with the narrative of security, and And so I do think it's important to understand that, because AFRICOM's operations in Africa over the last decade have included hundreds of drone strikes, billions of dollars in quote-unquote aid development projects through the USAID, and countless massive military exercises. And so when we talk about the relationship between AFRICOM and Sudan, it's important to understand that while there's no military AFRICOM presence, there is, I believe a comrade said in the webinar that Black Alliance for Peace held around AFRICOM that we do every year at the top of the month, he spoke to there being like a human resources department of AFRICOM that's stationed in Sudan, which is okay. All right. But the relationship between AFRICOM and Sudan is not one that's a simple cause and effect, but a strategic entanglement. So AFRICOM's presence and priorities have shaped the regional security landscape in ways that inadvertently empowered the very actors like the RSF, who now threaten to shatter, the entire state of Sudan, while the command remains unable, they can kind of play like they don't have anything to do with it, but they're in a strategic relationship with the UAE.
So they're in a relationship with the UAE, and that takes us to the Juma Boutique, who says Sudanese are being killed due to that Arabs can loot their gold. Is that along the same lines of the point that you just made? Is that too simplistic of an argument?
I would say it's a bit simplistic. Because one, yes, we can say that this is the UAE being an Arab nation, right? Predominantly, that is what they're doing. And so this gives the RSF a form of international legitimacy, right? To be backed by the UAE, who gets to be played like they're on the right side of this. So while the US may not be directly arming them, they're arming the UAE, who is arming the RSF. So when we discuss the United Arab Emirates, the geopolitical influence that they have as regional partners to the US and to Israel, particularly in Sudan. We can also talk about them being in Palestine, Haiti, Somalia, Yemen, Congo. I mean, it goes on and on. But we really must understand that the UAE's geopolitical influence is deeply intertwined with its relationship with the US and Israel. So they're not lone actors, but it is allowing them, or enabling them rather, to play a significant role in the conflicts and political developments in the region. Because the UAE's strategic investments and military interventions and diplomatic maneuvers are designed to secure its regional hegemony, while also aligning heavily with these Western powers. Because we can also talk about the expansion of growth, how UAE was a little desert that could, to where it is now, right? And that is not, again, by happenstance. But the UAE has been not only involved in Sudan, but thinking about the military, the training and mercenary operations in Yemen, involved in the Yemen conflict, or its relationship and involvement right now with Palestine and Gaza, right? So we can say, in one instance, sure, this is a strategic, geopolitical, strategic way for them to maintain control over Sudan's resources, which is gold, which includes gold. But then they're also involved in Haiti, in Congo, in in Somalia, in Yemen, in Gaza. So this complex web of alliances and actions, it underscores UAE's ambition to be a dominant regional partner, often at the cost of exacerbating these conflicts, right? And undermining the self-determination of regions and sovereignty and democratic aspirations of these nations.
So let me ask a very simple, if not simplistic, question. I always say to folks that when you get into these kinds of conversations, it's important to look at a map. So if you understand the geography, the UAE is on the Persian Gulf.
Mm-hmm.
Then you got to go through, I think you got to go through Saudi Arabia to get to the Red Sea. And then after you cross the Red Sea, now you're at Sudan. So explain, is this a geographic conflict? Is this a resource conflict? Is this a religious ideological conflict? Why Sudan? Is that too simplistic of a question?
Well, no, I mean, we could say, why not Sudan, right?
I knew that's what you were going to say.
We can make that argument as well, right? Because I think what AFRICOM and the US, EU, NATO axis of domination, as it has been playing out, has been successful in doing, is breaking up or balkanizing Africa in these particular regions, right? So we think of East African conflicts and West African conflicts and Southern African conflicts and North African conflicts, right? And then even to some extent Central African, or we look at things below and above the Nile in ways in that, right? Without really kind of, to your point of a map. When we look at the broader Africa, then the question becomes, what does it mean for a continent this big, this vast, this wide, this resource heavy, to be in conversation, to not be balkanized, to not be split up in parts, right? What does that mean in a geopolitical means, right? Mm-hmm. And then that becomes the question of revolutionary Pan-Africanism as a political objective, right? Which is why there's a continuance to continue to kind of split apart and break apart and balkanize the continent. Because, I always ask people when they talk about Sudan and this question of, or pose it in the terms of humanitarian aid or human rights, why are there two Sudans?
I think thank you, George. I think thank you, George Bush, is the answer to that question.
Right. And Hillary Clinton.
Her too. Yeah.
But right. So the way that Africa and African conflicts are talked about is a very like, oh, these things just fell out of the sky, or Africa's always in conflict, or these these ruthless leaders, without any real interrogation of the hows and the whys and how we come to be here, and what does it mean for a broken apart and balkanized continent as we move forward. And so I think that is what the significance of an AES poses today, right? The advancement of them going from an alliance to a confederation, because they're currently a confederation, and then these conversations about being a federation and the impact it's having on the surrounding nations, right? The ability to have removed AFRICOM from Niger, where we previously was only Eritrea that did not have an AFRICOM presence. So I think that speaks to what we're seeing happening. So when we look at East Africa, I can appreciate the webinar the ways that the Africa team and the Black Alliance for Peace really begin to kind of have these conversations where last year there was a heavier focus, I think more broadly because of Traore and such, about what is actually developing in West Africa. And then as we see the conflicts, continuing in the Congo and Sudan, there was a conversation about what's happening here. But I also think when we talk about, this month of action, I do want to highlight what the theme of the month of action is.
Go ahead, please.
21st century neocolonialism, capitalism, compradors, and the ongoing scramble for Africa. And so when we talk about like these sort of crises and neocolonialism that's occurring in East Africa, I think we need to have a conversation about Kenya, because Kenya presents itself as a regional stabilizer, quote unquote. But then we see that its actions reveal that it's nothing more than a security subcontractor for Western and Gulf interests. And this plays out, we talked about Kenya in its occupation of Haiti with its police force, but it also plays out in Sudan. Because as we discussed Kenya's role in Haiti as blackface imperialism, because of the U.S.-backed Kenya-led mission to Haiti, is a police occupation aimed at suppressing this sort of crisis of imperialism manifesting as gang violence, right? And also to secure political status quo in Haiti. But we've spoken to that irony of a Kenya police force, which has its own documented record of human rights abuses and extrajudicial killings and mass protesting against the government, being sent to pacify a Black Caribbean nation. But if we're viewing these geopolitical movers as interlocking aspects of Western imperialism, then they represent the normalization, if you will, of U.S. military command style pacification model, but with an African face, or like we said, with a Black face. So it's making it more politically palatable for the international community. And this brings us to Sudan, because while as they were preparing to send police to Haiti, Kenya's having key financial and logistical meetings with the RSF. And this is the very militia and committing genocide in Darfur, right? That we're speaking about. And this is not, again, by happenstance. These are not accidents. These reflect these sort of alliances of a neo-colonial order where a nation could simultaneously play quote unquote peacekeeper in one aspect, in this kind of theater, and enable in another aspect, enable a brutal militia. And this is all based on the financial and political interests of its external partners. And we can see that again with the UAE, right? So we need to begin to understand the role of these kind of proxy states, if you will, that are amplifying or continuing what's going on, and not see them as, these kind of separate kind of conflicts, because the same logic that sends Kenyan police to pacify Haiti allows the UAE to use the RSF to pacify and partition Sudan. It's a unified global playbook of pacification that's all kind of being like hamstringed in by the U.S. essentially.
Well, in fact, I'm glad that you put it in the context of the neo-colonial order and the you said pacify states, because folks need to understand Kenya as a former British colony. So hence the neo-colonialism, and Ruto, that then helps to answer the question of whose interests are William Ruto really addressing, because he's not addressing the needs of the average Kenyan. He is a tool in oppressing the Black Haitian at the behest of the United States, and again, former British colony that has never really been able to move beyond its neo-colonial role.
Yeah. And we see that even the surrounding nations, Rwanda, Uganda, it's the same colonial or neocolonial capture, if you will, that they are being led by their own personal interests. And I think what we're seeing with displays of protests in Kenya is that we have a generation who are tired of comprador leaders, right? But what does it mean to remove the comprador leader? And I think that's the question that we're figuring out, because removal of the comprador leader while the colonial aspects still exist, like an AFRICOM, means what? Right? And I think those are the questions that are being answered right now in the AES. They're being asked and answered, or at least being asked and thought about to be able to answer. And this is something that I think is brewing as we look at the conflicts that are happening across East Africa, because it's not just Sudan, but we're also looking at Somalia is looking to split in a similar way. So we see that these are a sort of rinse and repeat kind of playbook actions by the U.S. and the West more broadly in terms of how they intend to keep their hegemony or maintain their hegemony through these military commands and through these proxy states and actors.
Isn't part of the answer to the question about the removal of the leader who's actually responsible for removing the leader? Because when you look at the Alliance of Sahel States, that's a coup d'etat. That's an organic coup d'etat that is operating on behalf of Burkinabes and the other Nigerians and others, as opposed to the vacuums that gets created when the United States comes in, deposes a leader, and creates this power vacuum, which then, as in Libya, for example, which then results in just enhanced, exponentially created chaos.
Yeah, and in Sudan, right, is an example of them imposing leadership in that way. And I think even to speak of Libya, much of I guess you can call Libya a Tinder, if you will. It lit that match because it exasperated quote unquote terrorism and spread, clear into the West, where Boko Haram, etc., the Bring Back Our Girls hashtag, if folks remember that psyop. But these are ways that we've seen AFRICOM being able to kind of reassert themselves as a security apparatus protecting these nations and these peoples, and where the AES plays a role, or what their significance rather, in terms of how this is playing out in this sort of fight back. And so we talk about, to your point, who changes the leadership. I think there has been a sort of misconception, because it's military, that it has not been in lock and, well, I don't want to say lock and step, but this has not been a people's sort of movement that that the people are not behind it.
And that's why I use the word organic.
Right. And I do think that this calls for why there's a necessity for a deeper interrogation of Africa, because the way that people do not discuss Africa, as all of these things are significantly happening, I think really speaks to a misunderstanding, or maybe not clearly understanding why Niger looks different from Gabon, or why Burkina Faso's coup was different from oh Lord, why does it slip me now? Guinea-Bissau? No, was it Guinea-Bissau? No. Lord, I'll get back to it. Sekou Touré's country. And that's, I'm like, why is that drawing a blank? But yeah, so we've seen coup back to back to back in the last 5 years, I'd say, right? But they do not look the same, and I do think it speaks to the interrogation of what's happening, which is why the month of action against AFRICOM is, I think, pretty pivotal in how we're able to have these discussions and really interrogate what is happening on the continent. Because out of the month of action and out of the U.S. out of Africa, the Black Alliance for Peace Africa team comes the U.S. out of Africa network, where we are in conversation with grassroots organizations across the continent and being able to decipher what is and is not happening, how we should be understanding what's happening and how we should not. How is it affecting a people? What is the grassroots movement? What is the organic movements that are happening? What are the conversations that are happening? And these are all things that are happening in that network. Which allows us to have these sort of, well, one, it allows me to be a lot more informed about what's happening on the continent, but it also allows us to produce things like the webinar that where people are not hearing so much about what's happening in Sudan as we talk about all the time, right? I think people mention that when we talk about Palestine, there's not enough conversation. These are places where these conversations are being had, right? And so I think the question for me becomes, where is it more important? Should we be having the broader kind of public awareness conversation, or should we be really uniting and connecting with organizations on the ground who are in struggle and seeing what are the strategic discussions we need to be having around how do we, get AFRICOM and the U.S. out of Africa, and what are the sort of models that are developing from east to west, from north to south.
So as we wrap this up, because you've been very gracious with your time, and I know you've got a tight calendar today. Talking about getting AFRICOM out of Africa, what are the three salient points that you want the audience to take away from that part of this discussion?
Yeah, I think even as we talk about these sort of months of actions, even as we talk about how these things are interconnected, I do think I want to leave it with, why does it matter to us, right?
Mm-hmm. Okay.
There's a reason why things are not discussed, or not more of a discussion among us, right? Especially as African descended people, or people consider themselves African, etc. But I do think that when we talk about these commands, whether it is CENTCOM or AFRICOM or the Indo-Pacific Command or SOUTHCOM or the new Space Command that is in existence, because the U.S. has carved up the world into military commands and space. When we talk about these things, we have to remember that global and domestic imperialism are counterparts, right? So these technologies and methodologies are not discarded. They're not left in Palestine. They're not left in Sudan. They're not left in Haiti. They are commodified and militarized by a Homeland Security industrial complex, right? So we have to stop analyzing these crises in isolation. The war in Sudan, the mission in Haiti, the militarization of police, or like Dr. CBS likes to say, the police-ification of our military here domestically, are interconnected symptoms. We have a global security architecture or apparatus where technologies of control are tested abroad and they're brought home, and vice versa. We have African nations that are incentivized to act as mercenaries and proxies, undermining their own sovereignty and regional solidarity. When we talk about a comprador class, we should be understanding that, or at least aligning that with a Black misleadership class, right? That role that they play as a buffer towards our own kind of liberation. And then Black and brown bodies, or colonized people, whether in Darfur or Port-au-Prince or here in Baltimore, they are the primary targets of this system of control. So it's not only exemplified by the release of a National Guard and ICE into our major cities, but into the ongoing policies of austerity and then war that local police departments have, like the access to the now Department of War 1033 program. And then we talk about these data centers, right, that are popping up all over the place. Stingray cell site stimulation, that's part of that. Predictive policing algorithms, things that they're testing in Gaza, it's coming back home. Things that they're testing in Sudan are coming back home, and I think folks refer to that as a sort of boomerang effect. So I do think, like, when we talk about, or at least to end it here, the fight for justice in Sudan is intrinsically linked to the fight for justice, whether it is in Haiti, Congo, Palestine, Venezuela, and the fight against police brutality here in the U.S. in our own internal colonies. They are all battles against the same neocolonial, militarized, white supremacist U.S. EU axis of domination, and this sort of blow up the world logic to maintain hegemony.